but it's quite conceivable that the failure to bring both the Saudis and the Emiratis around the Sudanese table was actually, I think, counterproductive. It didn't help the process because the UAE probably kept arming the RSF, and that wasn't very helpful. Now, how would a future peace process look like? I share Razia's point, which is there isn't one single actor who can fix Sudan. Today's conflicts are geopolitical conflicts, as I said. They feed on multiple conflicts. No one actor can resolve them. What you need is, first of all, a credible actor in the region to stand up and say, I'll take the lead, but then the other powerful actors with leverage putting support and weight behind that single regional actor. The proposition from this conference is that Kenya, for natural reasons, can play that leading role. And I'm all happy to, see my country, go down that route and show the leadership that it showed during the Sudanese civil war, where Kenya was instrumental in actually a very amicable parting of ways between the North and the South through a peace process. Unfortunately, civil war came up later, but that is not a fault of Kenyans. I think Kenya has invested a lot, but we should be careful against, framing these as either or, framing these as an exclusionary process. Kenya can probably take the lead, has the offices, it's also not very costly. The Sudanese elite also have their feet here, so it is possible to engineer some kind of a peace process, but that will depend on actually how Kenya also maneuvers and also how Kenya manages to build support from other regional players. Because of subsidiarity, Kenya is a regional member, is a part of IGAD, so it can easily bring the AU on board. But then Kenya will have to do important diplomatic legwork and involve the Middle East and bring at least the Gulf actors around that process. Will Kenya be able to do that? I really don't know, because you are also dealing with very powerful actors. You are dealing with also economic and resource imbalance. These powerful states can sometimes be very arrogant and say, why is a tiny nation, Kenya, trying to take leadership? Why can't we, So there is that rivalry and friction, which also loses us a lot of time, but I think there is prospect. I want to end with one message, a message of actually hope and optimism. Sudan is an important player, in Africa, but also one country which has important social capital. It has per capita the highest number of actually people who are skilled, trained, educated. If you go to the Gulf countries today, you will find a significant diaspora community who are teachers, lawyers, professors, engineers, all of them from Sudan. Sudan built a first-rate educational system. So you have a very well-educated society. That is huge social capital. Number two, we saw the Sudanese revolution 5 years ago. In no other country did you see an uprising that was not ethnic, but an uprising of a civic society led, yes, a civil society-led revolution which actually pushed positive change. And so there is hope for Sudan. It is not just a byword for conflict. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Abdi. It was fascinating to hear you, especially trying to end on a positive note. I found it really interesting or shocking that now we see this fragmentization of conflicts, which we've seen in other countries like Yemen, Libya. Probably the next step is, the conflict parties will set up their parallel authorities. Everybody wants to have a central bank, a customs authority, a visa office. Terrible to think about. But next, please, Mr. Mazar, the floor is all yours.
Yes. Thank you very much. I had some stuff up here. I was tasked to talk about the effects of this conflict on the refugee populations, the displaced, and migrants and so on, especially the internally displaced. We can go to the next slide, and I just had a few graphics there, an overview of it all. And so we have a conflict at play here, an internal conflict that has immediate sub-regional and broader cross-regional implications. You have conflict-related displacement, conflict and displacement geographies, implications on migrant populations, the humanitarian impact, which Doctor has spoken about here, UNHCR and other actors are keen on, and governments and so on. But importantly, what are the priority steps as we get into it, and so on? Let me just speak briefly about the background of it. So, we have all these actors here and issues to this conflict. Sudan has a background of the conflict that goes back to, at independence in '56, and then, of course, the rebellion in the south, and the whole thing. So now, I don't know, maybe we can call it a challenge of state formation. Professor Ali Mazrui said that some of our countries are still grappling with the cultural and historical attributes of nationhood and the political and historical attributes of statehood on the other hand. And these problems have been there, and like the colleague before me was talking about some of these groups were formed for regime sustenance and survival, and they've come back to hound the country and so on. So interesting issues there about matters of governance and so on. So, even as we treat the symptoms and the effects of these conflicts, there are still structural issues at the bottom that, if you get it wrong from the beginning, then where are we going? The British, for example, failed to take care of Southern interests in the arrangements for independence in Sudan in 1956. And that's why we had that problem. And including up to the Nile Basin issues and also the countries gained independence and repudiated the whole thing. And some of these things then are rooted in history. And we've got also to think about them like that. Next. So, this timeline of events, these issues have been mentioned here. Sudan has had a history of coups. General Jaffa Nimeri. They had a short stint with Sadiq al-Mahdi, and then later, Omar al-Bashir. And then now what we have, and it's part of also a historical problem that I was talking about. Like if people have been ruled by authoritarian systems, how do you change overnight? And I think the push for democracy and so on probably could not find a place in terms of systems don't change radically. And people thought, is this an extension of the Arab Spring kind of thing? How sustainable? Systems don't change radically. They may change in form, but not content. And those things also we must think about. Okay, let's go to the next one. Next slide, please. Nabwire, are you able to navigate this one for me? Okay, yeah. Okay, back there, okay. No, let's go beyond that, there. So, in a nutshell, before this conflict, think about a greater Horn of Africa sub-region that already had displaced populations, internally displaced persons, refugees, political asylum seekers, and so on, and the issues that come with that. And now we have all these, pockets of new stocks of IDPs and new migrant waves of refugees and so on, So, then we are not talking about just Sudan itself. We're talking about Chad, Central African Republic, Ethiopia, Eritrea, South Sudan. And think about belligerents in these conflicts. You find fighters from Chad, next time they're in a Central African Republic, the next time they're in a, it's a whole conflict system with push and pull factors that work back and front, vice versa, and so on. And you find people who are just there to survive, and they're just, you can call them anything, but they're just fighters. It's their job, they go do it. And think about, again, organized, groups other than RSF and so on, some mercenaries around there, and other clandestine interests of state and non-state actors, or at least proxy actors for states. So, so you can see in 157 days from the start of the conflict, we're talking about displaced 4.2 million, altogether, IDPs, and so on. So the numbers are just big, and it comes with pressure on resources, pressure on governance systems, and other issues. Let's go to the next slide. Let's see. So you have these geographies here. State of origin, the conflict is worsening instability in areas where peace was delicate. Darfur's, that kind of thing, Kordofan, that kind of thing. More displacement from traditional displacement epicenters. So it's just getting worse, sort of convoluted the picture. Returnees in these regions have been forced back into IDP camps and refugees across international borders. So, that kind of thing. Please, so you can see the green circles here. New refugees in neighboring countries. Displaced individuals, IDPs by locality, and so on. So it's a whole disturbance of a situation that was already convoluted by other factors ex ante. And now the conflict is ongoing. We are not talking about something that has stopped. So it's likely to get worse as other participants and presenters have said. Okay. So what are the implications? And this is what is important. More refugees and IDP waves. 4.5 million were displaced before the conflict. 3.7 million IDPs, 800,000 refugees, 1.1 million projected, 1.8 million new refugees by end of 2023. Worsening humanitarian crisis in the Horn of Africa. You throw that at the governments and all these actors, intergovernmental organizations, the international community. Good and bad. Host countries are already stretched and face internal instabilities. And if you listened to General Burhan in the fringes of the United Nations General Assembly, saying that there was something a little veiled in that statement, saying, this conflict will affect our neighbor, this conflict will come to you. That statement scared me, like think twice, Vulnerability for refugees in Sudan, and the country's, host status. Sudan itself hosts over 800,000 refugees. So 116,995 new asylum seekers in the EU zone from Sudan. So they push. So we're talking about all this immigration crisis and questions and people coming to Lampedusa and all this and into Italy and all that and Spain and into the EU. How about that, Asylum applications have grown from 18,000 in 2022 to 36,000 in 2023. Well, if you say X causes Y, there's an aspect of the X that you might apportion to all this. So, you know, like that. Okay. These are just issues about pressure. Pressure on the country itself, pressure on the region, and so on. So displaced people come with a lot of problems. The organizations that handle them, you know, UNHCR, governments that should host them, hosting communities, and other things that are just at the very basic societal level. You would have seen, I mean, they report this every time in Al Jazeera and so on, across people just crossing from Sudan into Chad, and then these people say we don't even have food to give them, and that kind of thing. So, you know, gender-based violence, we have to think about children, child protection, general protection, physical security, food and livelihoods. Some people move as asylum seekers or refugee status, and the country to which they have gone has stabilized, and they may start to have livelihoods, and before they know, there's another conflict. And so they are displaced and that kind of thing. So the humanitarian conflict impact is both physical security. Remember, we are having problems with, as countries, in places where we should have protected populations, vulnerable populations, and those populations are infiltrated by groups that are not good. They're infiltrated by Al-Qaeda, they're infiltrated by, you can say, people, you know, the whole Houthi thing, and then governments supporting others and this kind of thing. We want to be sensitive to countries, but there are issues there. And then just here we have a problem with Dadaab itself. If Kenya itself would have a problem with Dadaab, you know, we have agents there of ISIS, Dawla Islamiyya fi al-Iraq wa al-Sham, Rakat al-Shabab al-Mujahideen, and all these things, and it's a big problem. All right? So what are the priority areas? Humanitarian access, and this one is for everybody. Increase funding for humanitarian access, assistance. Peacekeeping, regional protection force deployment. We need people to protect these civilians in the middle of all this as we get governments and these actors to talk. Robust political dialogue. A reform roadmap. You have to get to, Dr. Cheng will tell you, you need maybe some hearting statement. They had problems here when we were talking with the Somalis. We brought President Museveni in and all this in 2004, 2003. And see how far we've gotten with Somalia up to now. How about South Sudan, what is going on in Libya, and this kind of thing. And it's within the same fringes of all these epicenters of conflict and so on. So, you know, alleviate hunger, starvation, and disease, you know, livelihood support, transition to civilian democratic rule. It's lofty, but that would be the ideal. That's what, but you know, the guns are still not silent, and so on and so forth. And as the Africans, are we just spectators here? Or this thing is to be handled by EU and other people who have their own problems. And friendly governments, some that want to help. There is not a country that goes out for picnic with another one without its own interests being taken care of. There is a push here. These push factors are going to make it worse for asylum seekers, for illegal immigrants, and so on. This will affect the EU. Are we just going to throw it all at the EU, or are we going to help as Africans to clean our house? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So now we have about, 4 or 5 minutes, I hope maybe a bit more, for questions. Who has questions, please? Nobody? I don't think so. Yes, please. Okay, maybe we're collecting.
Strange avoid putting up my hand again, but I can't see anyone with that.
Anyone else, please? We've heard. Yes, sir, please. And maybe a third question, then we. Sorry. Anyone else has a question? Yes, please. Okay. So now we have three, starting with the lady. Yes, ma'am, please go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you to all the presenters. Just a very quick question. I know that Egypt was still treating Sudanese who were trying to gain access into Egypt as migrants, so they were having to get visas. Is this still the case? And if so, it would be useful if somebody could lobby for them to be treated as refugees so that they don't have to have the added burden of getting visas.
Okay, maybe the next question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Maybe a comment and also some call for ideas about what Mr. Nzau has concluded. My comment would be on a statement made by Rashid. And it's an issue that's being hotly debated in Sudan, particularly in the social media, about the identity of the RSF fighting forces. And this is a very complex issue. Having worked in Chad and worked a little bit on the Sahel, I know what the degree of, I would say, blend and interrelations that exist between the Sahel region and Sudan. And to my knowledge, since independence, the essential fighting force in the Sudanese army was either the so-called Arabs of Darfur, and by extension, Chadians, Nuba Mountains, and Southern Sudanese. Now the Southern Sudanese are out. We remain with the Darfurians essentially, and we should never forget that when we talk about Darfur and Chad, we have to take, I worked in Chad as charge in the 80s, and I have seen by myself the degree of a blend and interconnection that exists between the two countries. Cross-border identity is very important. When we were at the embassy in the 80s, we need to issue, we used to issue, identity cards for the population in the border areas so that to move around freely without passports. So to say categorically that we are fighting this war are Chadians, I would beg for some kind of, more. We have to be careful about what we are saying. This is all that I'm saying, and this issue should be up to. A very interesting conclusions are made by Mr. Nzau. I think we need to further develop that. Maybe we do not have the time, particularly the issues of ceasefire, deployment of a regional or protection force, how this can be done, how it can be accepted by the belligerents, how can be presented to them, what conditions. I think this is an idea that we need to debate it. I worked on peacekeeping issues, so I know a little bit about the complexity of these issues. While envisaging this possibility, we have to see exactly how we can facilitate this so that it can be acceptable to the belligerents. Otherwise, whatever force that we deploy can be part of the problem rather than part of the solution. The issue of civilian rule and transition to civilian rule, as someone who believes in that and will continue working for that, I do not see this happening without resolving our relations with the military and with the RSF. So we should also take that into consideration and continue working to see how this can happen. Thank you very much.
War now raise a very serious question about the validity and the assumptions that all of us, we have been working with until the war started. the assumptions that they have been there are they still valid? So if I take it just an example here, let's say Hizb al-Ummah, just an Ummah. Everybody knows the history of Hizb al-Ummah, where it comes from and so on. After the war, is it valid? FFC, is it valid? And all the members within the FFC, is it valid? And all that. So this war now created a new, let's say, local leadership. And besides that also, that before we used to bring the military and SPLM here in Kenya, we found an agreement between them, which is the CPA, and then we found a solution to the problem of Sudan. Today, if we found a solution between Burhan and Hemeti, does it resolve the problems in Sudan? There is now multiple of conflicts, multiple of agenda, so there is no more fighting between A and B, but there is A and B, B and C, C and D, and etc., etc., etc. The time that will continue. So I think when we are talking about that there has to be a leadership on the political process, and we all agree the African Union, Kenya needs to play a very important role, that we need to be very careful that at the moment we don't just work and take as givens the assumptions that we have been working on before. So therefore there is a necessary period that you allow to see how then you can create again a civilian united front so that it can assume the responsibility post a ceasefire or cessation facilities. Those assumptions we need to be very careful because they might not be 100% valid.
No, thank you very much. It was really interesting to hear, with bringing Burhan, Hemeti together won't solve the conflict. We've seen it in South Sudan, Salva Kiir, Riek Machar. Now it's difficult to say who's actually fighting. Now it has fragmented so often. It's A, B, C, D. It's impossible to come to an end. Janan, you wanted to say something?
Yeah,
Then
very short question. I'm interested in the management of the humanitarian crisis that this conflict has led to. Who is in lead? What does the African Union do about the humanitarian crisis? Is it a problem that Sudan was suspended from the African Union and that's why African Union does not feel maybe responsible? If anyone could maybe respond to this question, thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman, then we go about responding. Thanks.
Thank you once again to all the presenters. My question is to all, but specifically to Rashid. What would you suggest as some of the confidence building measures that the region and the continent should undertake to engage the parties to fast-track this peace process? What are some of those confidence-building measures or opportunities for peace that you see? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Maybe starting first with a question on humanitarian issues, whether how Egyptian Sudanese are treated by Egyptian government, the refugees, and who's managing them. Monica, do you want to respond to that? And maybe also touching the question briefly, who is managing the humanitarian effort now? Excuse me, the lady needs a mic, please.
Thank you. As the government is so fragmented, the UN is taking the lead on the humanitarian part. So all the efforts, negotiations, engagement with the government and all the parties at very high level are done by the different UN bodies. African Union has its role, politically mainly, but yes, all humanitarian action is led by the UN. On regards to Egypt, I'm not sure on the answer. Maybe Joanina there. Yes, at the beginning the visa was established, but I really don't know what is the current status of affairs. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, then the last question regarding what confidence measures can be applied? What can the African Union do? I mean, Rashid or Mr. Zhao, do you want to both maybe say something?
Yes. Switch it on. Let me try, but I think it's the confluence of the sound. Mine was trapped by the other one there. All the same, I think when you have a space that the center does not hold, and that is what is going on inside Sudan, then you leave it to other people to manage your problems, and there are people whose voices then don't have, the government represents people, and when these people are displaced, there's no one to speak for them except Médecins Sans Frontières and other organizations where these countries have made commitments. And these commitments come with resources. And if those resources are not forthcoming, and they are not followed through, they are just on paper, then there is a problem. And there is also a global strain since COVID, and what is going on in Eastern Europe, sometimes everyone also seems to be looking there, not looking what is happening in these places. There's a problem there. And the intergovernmental organizations involved also, the civil society organizations and so on, should also tell governments that it's not all about there, but also here. And things happening there have also made things very worse. You can imagine all the grain that would come from that end of the world. And these organizations actually need those inputs in order to, and governments have to buy them, and so on. So the picture becomes convoluted in terms of sometimes the sequence of things. So fundamentally, there are structures. The peace facility within the AU, the Africa Peace and Security Architecture, there are things there. But before you get into somebody's country, you have to have their consent. You have to sit in places where you have to have a political buy-in, and you just don't say anything about governments, and I think Ambassador here was careful. You just don't say anything about countries. So you've got to be a little bit conservative with that. And thus they are laying the problem, because some of these structures that have formed international humanitarian law and so on, it took years to build them from Battle of what do you call that battle? 1859 up to the formation of the Red Cross, all the way to the Geneva Conventions, 49, and the additional protocols. That's what is guiding everyone. But we have other things that the other day, just in Kampala, is when we set the protocol on internally displaced people in 2010. I've been writing about that. So, we don't have, again, then to say, okay, it's all defeated. I think the entry point is to write in a good way, in a persuasive way, to governments to put their heads together, so that resources can go to the right places in a nice way. And again, sustainability. Because we can resolve things and get things signed, but how do you make it sustainable so that the peace then endures? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nazau. But it's really valid point pointing out that Europe is so busy with Ukraine, so there's funding is drying up, but there's less attention while we have this major crisis in Sudan. Please, Rashid, that will be also the final remarks. No, thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't want to be the last person to speak before lunch. Just to answer something which His Excellency Ambassador Sarki said, I didn't want to give an impression that the RSF, the bulk of the RSF, is actually brought in Chad. Maybe what I ought to have said is that a significant component of the fighting force has roots. A significant component of those who are fighting within the ranks of RSF are actually militiamen from Chad. That's, I think, just to clarify. But the ambassador is quite correct about what he said. On the issue of confidence building are carrots which you deploy, at a certain phase of a negotiated process. It does not begin before the parties have agreed to actually dialogue. At the moment, I don't think it is the right moment to talk about confidence building measures because the parties are very far apart. The conflict dynamics have not produced a heartening stalemate. And so until the parties agree to dialogue, and then they come around the table, and then you ask the question, what are some of the confidence building measures to keep the parties talking? But I think it is premature to probably address that at the moment.
Thank you very much to the three distinguished panelists. It was very, really interesting listening to you, and we can also continue debating the issue over lunch. Enjoy your lunch. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Just a reminder, if you don't have a voucher, the wonderful ladies here will give you a voucher for lunch. Please, if you don't mind. And let's make sure that in our next session, we try to keep time. So again, when we're asking questions, please let's not give speeches. Let's stick to 30 seconds. This time, I'm going to be holding a timeout at the back. So when I show it to you, just know your time is up, even though I'll not be the one moderating. Thank you very much. Please, the lunch is going to be served at the restaurant. May all of us go and enjoy our lunch, but make sure you have a voucher before you head out. We're going to bring it to you wherever you are. You have until 2:30, please. Let's all be here by 2:30.